At 19, Diane made a promise to herself. Give everything now. To him, to the kids who hadn't even been born yet. And one day, it would all be worth it. Maybe you made that same promise. Maybe you're still keeping it right now, without even realizing it's a promise at all. Just something you do, every day, without asking whether it still fits. 30 years later, Diane kept hers. Everyone else got everything. The best of her mornings, the best of her patience, the best of her time. And she got this, the quiet, the empty chair, a house that used to be loud with someone else's needs, and now just isn't. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because this isn't a sad story. I know it might sound like one so far. It isn't. It's the story of what she did next, at 52 years old, when almost nobody expected her to do anything at all. In a few months, Diane is going to do something that surprises everyone who loves her, including herself. She's going to sit at her kitchen table, alone, and make a decision that no one in her family saw coming. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's the first decision in 30 years that belonged entirely to her. But to understand what she does next, you have to understand everything she gave up first. Every choice, every, not right now, every version of herself she quietly set aside, one at a time, over 3 decades, until the woman standing in that kitchen barely remembered the girl she used to be. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before she was anyone's wife, before she was anyone's mother, she was just Diane. Funny, a little stubborn, the kind of 19-year-old who kept a spiral notebook full of half-finished plans because she liked having somewhere to put her hope. She had a plan, not a huge one, just hers. She'd been saving since she was 16, a little at a time, birthday money and babysitting money, for a trip. Nowhere fancy in the brochures she circled at the library, just somewhere she'd never been, somewhere that was only hers, that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or anyone else's needs. She used to say, "After this, I'll get to it." Then she met Mark, at a friend's backyard barbecue of all places. He spilled a drink on his own shoes trying to introduce himself, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. It was good. It was real. This isn't a story about a man who ruined her life. It's not that simple, and it never is. Mark loved her. In the way he knew how to love someone at 22, he made her laugh. He made her feel chosen, in a way she hadn't quite felt before. And when he asked her to marry him at 20, kneeling awkwardly in that same backyard 2 years later, she didn't hesitate for even a second. After the wedding, she told herself, packing away the brochures into a shoebox, "I'll get to it." 2 years later, their son Jason was born. Diane held him in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and new beginnings, and she remembers thinking, clear as anything, "This is the most important thing I will ever do." Every plan she'd ever made for herself quietly rearranged itself around that thought. After the baby's born, she said, when anyone asked about the trip, about the notebook, about the version of her life that used to be just hers, once things settled down, 3 years after that, Amanda came along. Louder, faster, impossible to keep up with from the very first week. Diane used to joke that Jason taught her how to be a mother, patient and careful, and Amanda taught her how to survive it, quick reflexes and very little sleep. She didn't know it yet, but that shoebox, the brochures, the notebook, the little bit of savings folded inside, would stay closed in the back of a closet for the next 30 years. None of what happened next felt like a crime. Each moment, on its own, felt like love. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. Nobody did anything wrong. It just adds up. A job offer, turned down, back when Jason was small. He had a fever that week, a bad one, and there was no version of Diane that could imagine being anywhere but by his bed. There'd be other jobs, she told herself. There always seemed to be other jobs, and somehow, she never quite got back to any of them. A doctor's appointment, canceled. Again, someone else needed the car that day, or the money was earmarked for something more urgent, or there just wasn't the hour to spare. She rescheduled it so many times the office stopped calling to remind her. The last piece of cake, every single birthday, always. Nobody ever noticed Diane never took a piece for herself. She didn't notice either, not yet. It was such a small thing to give up that it never once registered as giving something up at all. A trip with her sister, planned for months, canceled 2 days before for one of Amanda's dance recitals. Next year, Diane said. She said that a lot, about a lot of things, and she always meant it when she said it. A weekend painting class she'd circled in the community center catalog, the kind of thing that used to make her feel like maybe some part of that 19-year-old with the spiral notebook was still in there somewhere. She never signed up. There was a soccer tournament that Saturday. There was almost always something that Saturday. Add up enough small moments like that, over enough years, and something goes missing. Not all at once. That's the part that makes it so hard to notice while it's happening. A little at a time, until one day you look up and you don't quite recognize the woman in the hallway mirror because you stopped looking at her, really looking at her, a long, long time ago. Jason left for college first, 18 years old, backseat full of boxes, radio too loud. Diane waving from the driveway with a smile that took absolutely everything she had left in her that morning. That one hurt in a way she wasn't fully ready for. The first true emptying of a house that had been full for 2 decades. But Amanda was still home. There was still a reason to keep the lights on early, dinner on the table by 6, the calendar crowded with someone else's practices and projects and problems to solve. For 6 more years, Diane kept going, kept giving, because giving was the only rhythm she knew how to keep time to. She told herself the strange, hollow feeling she got some nights, after everyone was in bed, was just missing Jason, that it would pass, once things finally settled down. She'd been telling herself some version of that sentence for 30 years. Then, one Tuesday, an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday, the kind that gives no warning at all, Amanda packed the last box into her car, hugged her mother a little longer than usual at the door, the way you do when some part of you already knows what's about to change, and drove away. The house didn't just get quiet, it got honest. For the first time in 30 years, nobody needed anything from Diane. Not right this second, anyway. Not this hour, not today. And she genuinely did not know what to do with that. She stood in the grocery store, in the aisle with the face creams and the shampoos, trying to buy something just for herself, and realized she couldn't remember what she liked anymore. Not really. Somewhere in the last 30 years, without ever deciding to, she'd stopped being someone with preferences of her own. She'd become someone who managed everyone else's, what Mark liked for dinner, what Jason needed for his dorm, what Amanda's coach wanted for the team's snack schedule. She stood there for almost 10 minutes before she put something, anything, in the cart and left. "Mark, isn't this nice? We're finally free." He meant it kindly, and he wasn't wrong. For him, he'd gotten his freedom back the exact day the last kid left, clean and simple, no complications attached. Diane was still looking for hers. She wasn't even sure, if she was honest with herself, that she'd ever really had it to lose in the first place. You can't misplace something you never got to hold. Jason called on Sundays, like clockwork, always cheerful, always a little rushed on his way to something. His own job now, 3 states away, his own apartment, his own life quietly built without her in the room for any of it. He'd ask how she was doing every single week, and every single week she'd say, "Fine, busy," because that was the answer that ended the conversation the fastest, and asked nothing further of either of them. She didn't know how to tell her son that his mother didn't quite know who she was anymore, underneath all the fine. So, week after week, she just didn't try. She met up with Carol, her friend from the porch, from the notebook, from the version of 19 that felt like 100 years ago and also like yesterday. The one with the same dream, 30 years back. Carol had lived it. Not perfectly, nobody does, and Carol would be the first to tell you that, but she'd lived it. She'd taken the trips, chased the version of herself that Diane had folded up and put in a shoebox. There was no bitterness in Diane, watching Carol talk, hands moving as she described some market in some city Diane had only ever circled in a brochure. Just something quieter and heavier. Grief, plain and simple. For 30 years she hadn't let herself feel, because feeling it seemed like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. So she did what she always did, with a feeling that big. She poured more of herself out, hoping it would fill the emptiness back in. She offered to babysit more for the neighbors, hosted more dinners than anyone actually asked her to host, volunteered for the church fundraiser, then the school auction, than anything else that needed a pair of capable, willing hands. It didn't work. It never does. You cannot fill an empty well by pouring more of yourself out of it. Some nights she'd sit on the edge of the bed with the phone in her lap, thumb hovering over Jason's name, wanting, for once, to say something true instead of fine. She never quite pressed call. Old habits don't loosen easily, even when you finally, technically, have all the time in the world to loosen them. And that's where she found it, not looking for it, just cleaning, the way you do on a slow Saturday when the house is too quiet to sit still in. 30 years, folded up in an old shoebox, in the back of a closet, exactly where 22-year-old Diane had left it. For 30 years, Diane had asked one question, over and over, in 100 different forms. What does everyone else need? That morning, sitting on the floor of her closet with the shoebox open in her lap, for the first time in as long as she could remember, she asked a different one. What do I need? She was genuinely terrified of the answer, because if she let herself really want something again, after all this time, it might mean the last 30 years had been some kind of mistake, that she'd wasted something she couldn't get back. They weren't. But it would take her a while, a good while, to actually believe that. She thought about Jason on the other end of those Sunday calls, always asking, always getting fine in return, never once getting the truth. She thought about what he might say, how his voice might change, if she finally gave him something real to hear instead. Maybe, she thought, it was time. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table, the shoebox still beside her, and started looking, not seriously, just looking, the way you look at something you don't quite believe you're allowed to want. A modest little coastal town, nothing extravagant, exactly the kind of place 19-year-old Diane used to circle in library brochures. Her finger hovered over confirm booking for a long moment, and then she pressed it. Mark, you booked a trip? By yourself? Now? It wasn't cruelty in his voice. It was just unfamiliarity. Nobody in that family had ever once seen Diane want something out loud before, let alone act on it. They genuinely didn't know what to do with it. Neither did she, honestly, in that first moment. But she didn't take it back. She sat with the discomfort, instead of smoothing it over for him, the way she always had. That night, alone, she cried for the 22-year-old who put that shoebox in the drawer without a second thought. And she cried, a little, out of relief too, because that girl was finally getting an answer, 30 years late. Better late, she whispered to herself, into the quiet of the bedroom, than never. Here's the part nobody expected, including Diane herself. Choosing herself didn't destroy her family, the way some quiet fear in the back of her mind had warned her it might. It gave them back a person they hadn't actually seen in decades. The trip itself was small, by most standards. A handful of days in a town she'd never been to, a rented room above a bakery, mornings spent walking streets with no particular destination in mind. She got lost twice and laughed both times instead of panicking, which surprised her more than almost anything else on the whole trip. She tried food she couldn't pronounce. She sat by herself at a small table by the water for almost 2 hours one evening, and nobody needed anything from her the entire time, and it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like enough, I don't think I've ever heard you talk about you before. That's what Amanda said, weeks later, sitting across the kitchen table from her mother, scrolling through photos on Diane's phone. Diane on a rocky overlook. Diane laughing at something out of frame. Diane simply existing, unbothered, in a place that belonged only to her. For the first time in either of their lives, Diane and Amanda weren't just mother and daughter, sitting on opposite sides of a role neither of them had chosen. They were just two women, talking. Jason noticed the change too, even from 3 states away, even over the phone. The Sunday calls got longer somehow, without either of them planning it that way. Diane started actually answering the question instead of deflecting it, telling him about the trip, about a language app she'd started using, about a version of his mother he realized, listening, he'd genuinely never met before. He told her once, half joking but not really joking at all, that she sounded happier than he'd heard her in years. She laughed and told him she was working on it. It was the most honest thing she'd said to her son in a decade. Diane spent 30 years believing that loving her family meant slowly disappearing for them, one small sacrifice at a time, until there was almost nothing left of her to show up with. It took her until 52 to learn the truth was the opposite. She could only really show up for them, fully and honestly, once she finally showed up for herself first. She didn't get her 20s back. She didn't get the years of doctor's appointments she skipped, or the trips she canceled, or the quiet Saturdays she spent managing everyone else's plans instead of making one of her own. But at 52, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she got herself. If you've watched someone in your life give everything away like this, a mother, a sister, a friend, maybe even a version of yourself, or if this was your story too, in ways big or small, tell us about her in the comments. We read every single one. We'd really love to know what you think. If this story meant something to you, share it to a woman in your life who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself. New videos upload every week here on The Untold Tales, so hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.